This episode will take you through 3 cases proving that when you hear something strange in the wilderness, you should never, ever follow it. I'm Josh Pinocchio. This is what lurks beneath. You won't want to miss this cat. On the night of July 23rd, 2007, at around 9 his family's house on a reservation in rural Mexico. The house was a modest ranch-style home that had been passed down by his grandfather. While it was mostly surrounded by desert scrub, the back side of the property went right up to the edge of a densely wooded area that ran for about a mile.
That's true. A lot of times, spirits or creatures you don't want to know about in American culture will actually do that and everything. Will mimic people like skinwalkers. They will mimic animal noises or people that you know or your own voice to lure you out just to kill you.
And that's when he realizes that it's coming from outside, so he holds his breath so he can listen better. And it sounds like maybe it's just the wind or maybe an animal. As he continues to listen, he realizes that it's a sound he recognizes. It sounds exactly like a baby crying. At the time, Jacob had an older sister who had moved out years back, but her son had a really distinctive cry, and this sounds kind of like it. So Jacob is thinking, oh, they just dropped by for a visit. So he turns off the TV, he heads to the front of the house, fully expecting to see his sister and nephew. But when he opens the door, the driveway is empty. For a minute, everything's pretty quiet.
Skinwalker there.
Like this whole thing off is his
Or what you call Windoshi.
sound starts up again, and there's no mistaking it this time. The crying sound just keeps going, and it sounds more and more desperate by the second, just like a baby in distress. Naturally, he's thinking there's no way that's actually an infant. I mean, he's in the middle of nowhere for crying out loud. There's nobody around for miles. But as he continues to listen, the crying continues, and it sounds so real and human that he can't shake the feeling that maybe there really is a baby somewhere outside. And this is where he begins to feel really unnerved, because something about the entire situation isn't sitting right with him. He takes a closer look around. It's pretty dark by this point, but there's a full moon, so he can see pretty well across the property. And as he's looking around, he doesn't see anybody, but he can still hear this crying sound, and he thinks he can pinpoint where it's coming from. It seems like it's coming from the edge of the woods at the back of their property. And he stands there for a few moments just contemplating what his next move should be, and then heads back in the house and out the back door. Immediately, he can hear the crying even more clearly. No mistaking it, it's definitely coming from the woods. All these horrible thoughts are going through his mind, like, what if somebody just abandoned a baby out here? Or what if a toddler had somehow got lost? He knows it's unlikely, but he's not heartless. You just can't ignore it. So he steps off the porch and begins to walk across the backyard, heading towards the woods. At this point, the crying sounds are getting louder and louder as he's approaching the tree line. But when he reaches the edge of the woods, he stops for a moment. It's really dark. The moonlight that's lighting up the rest of the yard pretty much stops just a few feet into the forest. And the crying sounds like it's coming from just inside the woods. Even though he feels scared, he realizes that this could truly be an infant in need and that he just needs to be brave. So he takes a deep breath, and he steps into the forest. And he walks about 10 yards.
And the last time they ever see him again, too.
And stepping over any debris. And the entire time, the crying sound seems to be just ahead of him. But as he continues to walk, he notices something very odd. The sound doesn't seem to be getting any closer. He walks until he's about 20 yards into the woods.
Getting farther and farther away.
At this point, he's looking all around, turning in circles, trying to figure out exactly where this crying is coming from. But he still sees nothing. And as he's standing there, the crying suddenly stops. It just cuts off mid-cry, like someone flipped a switch. He's standing in the dark woods, all alone, and it is so quiet that he can hear a pin drop. And all of a sudden, this overwhelming feeling of dread takes over. Now, I don't know if any of you out there have ever gotten that gut feeling.
Oh yeah.
You realize you're in the wrong place.
Plenty of time when I'm out hunting.
That's what was happening. It's like he's being watched. The hair on the back of his neck stands up and feels really exposed and vulnerable.
Yep.
Without even thinking, he turns around and starts running back toward his house. And he hooks it inside. And once he's locked the door, he goes to the window and looks out towards the woods again. There's nothing there. At this point, there's no sound, there's no movement, there's really nothing unusual. And for whatever reason, the crying never returned, but neither did the sounds of the forest. That night, he really struggled to sleep. He wasn't sure if his mind was just playing tricks on him or what the deal was, but he was sure that what he heard was a baby crying. There was just no mistake. Well, the next morning, he comes to the kitchen for breakfast, and his dad is sitting at the kitchen table, drinking coffee, and his mom and sister aren't around. Jacob sits down at the table, and for a minute, he doesn't really say much, because he's not sure if he should bring up what happened last night. But then he decides that he has to tell somebody. Eventually, he admits to his father that something strange did happen last night. So when his dad asks what, Jacob explains the entire scenario from start to finish. But as he's telling his father the story, he notices his dad's expression completely change. He's no longer just casually listening. He's sitting up straight, and there's this look of concern on his face. And when he finishes his story, his dad is quiet for several moments. Jacob is convinced that his dad doesn't believe him, so he asks him if that's the case, and to his surprise, his father blows him away and explains that not only does he believe him, but that his own father shared the exact same story from when they lived there. Sometime long before Jacob was born, his grandfather was alone in the house, and according to what he told Jacob's father, he had been woken up by what sounded like an infant crying outside. And just like Jacob, his grandfather had gone out to the woods to investigate and found nothing. Even though he was using a flashlight, it seemed to stay just ahead of him, no matter how far he looked. And he looked for a long time, around an hour and a half before he eventually gave up. Needless to say, Jacob was in shock. His grandfather was a practical man, and if he heard it, then there was something to it. Safe to say that he avoided all the wooded areas altogether after that. And even during the day, when there was nothing to be afraid of, it still just wasn't worth the risk. Years later, a lot of the trees were cut down for lumber, but even then, Jacob refused to set foot back in what was left of the forest. Now, Jacob still doesn't know what made that crying sound. Was it some kind of animal that just happened to sound like a baby, or was it the wind playing tricks, or was it something else entirely? Maybe something that had been there long before his family moved onto the land. Something that had called out to both him and his grandfather years apart. Jacob learned a valuable lesson that a lot of us should learn. Trust your instincts. In August of 1961, in the small town of Rogers, Kentucky, a woman by the name of Mrs. Quinn was sound asleep in her bed. She lived in a modest home with her two daughters, Judy, who was 14, and Brenda, who was younger. Rogers was the perfect place for Mrs. Quinn to raise her children. Here, it was quiet, and nothing much ever happened. But on this night, everything seemed normal. But around 1:30 that morning, Mrs. Quinn suddenly woke up, and right away, she wasn't sure what had disturbed her sleep. There wasn't any loud noise or anything like that, but something had left her wide awake. And as she lay there in bed, trying to figure out what was going on, she had a strange feeling that something just wasn't right. And then she noticed it. Something was right beside her bed, or at least that's what it seemed like at first. But her eyes adjusted, and she realized that this thing wasn't standing there, it was floating, and there was no way on earth that it was a human being. Quinn was staring at some kind of entity. She would later describe the thing floating there as vaguely resembling a baby, except that it appeared too large and lumpy and sticky. Those are very odd adjectives for this experience. It was also dark, almost charcoal color in the dim light. The thing had a very round head that threw off its own light. The dark baby's eyes were glowing, and even weirder, the wrinkles of flesh that curled around the eyes seemed to glow on their own, too, almost as if there was a light coming from inside. All those bizarre details aside, the closest comparison that Mrs. Quinn could make was that it reminded her of a roly-poly bug. You know, the ones that curl up in a ball when you touch them. And as you'd imagine, she was terrified. I mean, imagine waking up in the middle of the night and seeing this bizarre thing floating right next to your bed. She was so scared, in fact, that all she could do was lay there, completely frozen and staring at this bizarre intruder that had somehow gotten into her bedroom. And then, just after hovering there for a moment, this thing began to move. Now, at first, she was relieved that it was leaving her room, but that was when she realized, in a moment of horror, it left the room, but it turned and went in the direction of where her two daughters were sleeping. And as it quietly glided out of sight, she finally managed to break through her paralysis. She jumped out of bed, rushed after this thing, desperate to protect her children from this thing, but when she caught up with it, what she saw made her heart stop. This thing was now hovering directly above Judy's bed, and Judy, of course, was wide awake at this point, staring up at this thing, and with absolute terror in her eyes. Strangely, Judy would later report that as this thing hovered above her, she felt a very bizarre sensation. Although it wasn't touching her at all, it felt like she was being physically pulled on against her will. It was like this thing was using some sort of control that made her want to get out of bed. The sensation was irresistible. She said that she could actually feel herself slipping off the bed, being drawn toward it by some sort of force. Now, if you're a parent, of course you've gone through a lot of scenarios in your head about how to protect your kids, but no one games out the scenario. So she doesn't know what to do, but just stands there in the doorway, watching this thing as her daughter is being pulled towards it. And then everything changed. It happened in an instant, just as suddenly as it had started. Judy said that the overwhelming urge to follow it just stopped. All Mrs. Quinn knew was that, at this moment, this dark baby simply blinked out of existence. It didn't leave from the door or the window. It just kind of vanished. This terrifying account would eventually come to the attention of Leonard Stringfield. Stringfield served as a public relations advisor for the UFO investigation organization, NICAP, which was the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena. NICAP was headed by Donald Kehoe, and they were one of the most prominent UFO research organizations in the United States at the time. Even though ufologists got involved, it's not clear that the creature that appeared in Kentucky that night was an alien. I mean, after all, no one in the Quinn family reported seeing anything in the sky, so if it wasn't an alien, then what was it? Could it have been a water baby or something similar that had manifested in their household? And if so, where did it come from? What did it want with Judy? And why did it suddenly disappear? Fortunately, we'll never know the answer to these questions. Whatever Mrs. Quinn and her daughters encountered that night in August of 1961 simply defies explanation and changed their perception of reality forever. What's really interesting is that the sound of babies crying in remote locations is something reported clearly on. Not only can some animals like cougars or bobcats make similar noises, but it is actually one of those things that pops up time and time again in various paranormal encounters. For example, late paranormal researcher John Keel noted that it was commonly heard in some UFO encounters. Go even further back, and European fairies were sometimes said to make similar noises in the forest at night. Nowadays, especially in North America, people associate the sound with Bigfoot. But as it turns out, Native Americans were certainly familiar with this phenomenon as well, and they sometimes blame these cries on mysterious entities known as water babies. They are powerful water spirits rooted in the folklore of several Western Native American tribes. They are said to inhabit bodies of water like springs, lakes, and streams. Those who have seen them describe them as creatures resembling human infants, and their cries are supposed to be omens of death or disaster. In various traditions, they might appear with fishtails or reptilian features, or might be the souls of babies who were drowned. Other times, you might never see them and only know about them from their haunting, disembodied cries that mimic human infants. Cries specifically designed to lure people into the woods. Responding to these cries and trying to rescue or interact with them is very dangerous because anyone foolish enough to try usually ends up drowned or cursed with bad luck or finds themselves in grave spiritual danger. But that doesn't mean that water babies are always bad. It's said that those with the proper training, like healers, can sometimes approach them respectfully. The spiritual leaders of some tribes can even perform rituals or offerings, ensuring safe passage on the water or even good luck fishing. Whatever the source, the sound of an infant crying in the outdoors is pretty disturbing. I mean, even though none of us would want to follow a noise like that, we're all biologically hardwired to respond. In fact, a study from the University of Oxford found that the human brain lights up whenever we hear babies crying. The parts of the brain that respond are often associated with our fight or flight response. We tag them as important, milliseconds before we consciously process the sound. It seems like a part of our brains ripe for manipulation, doesn't it? Well, the answer seems simple then, right? Just don't go outside and don't respond. In the early 2000s, a 17-year-old boy named Bill lived in a small town in rural Idaho, about 5 miles from a reservation. Bill's town was one of those places that maybe had 10,000 people, where everyone pretty much knew each other and parents generally felt safe letting their kids run around. I mean, you can picture it. Quiet, safe, and frankly, boring for teenagers. Well, to combat boredom, Bill and his best friend Paul would often just hop in the car and drive around at night with no one particular in mind, just exploring the back roads and remote areas of the county. Occasionally, when they really wanted some excitement, they would venture off into the reservation. The reservation wasn't off limits or anything like that. It was just a place that their parents rarely went, and that meant that it held a certain sort of mystique for the two boys. They heard the rumor that there was actually an old bridge where if you parked at night and turned off your engine and lights, you could supposedly hear cries of the water babies. Well, they knew exactly what their next adventure would be, and so the following weekend they decided to check it out. At this point, it was a little after 11
Yeah, note right there. Yeah, water babies. There are legends about parents used to drown their babies in the water on reservation lakes and everything like that, and the spirit trapped in the water. But my point is, don't do that, okay? Some legends on reservations you should not fuck with. I don't care if you got Native American blood or not Native American blood. Respect that area, okay? If somebody died in that area, then you need to respect that area, okay? That's their final resting place. But there are some people who don't respect that, and then when something happens to them, common sense will tell you, respect stuff, you won't get hurt. Alright, back to the show.
To unfamiliar territory. Bill had already been on the reservation during the day before, but everything looked different at night. You guys know how that is. Things look drastically different in the dark.
Oh yeah.
Paul asked whether or not Bill was sure about where they were headed, but Bill admitted he was positive, but he'd heard that the bridge was supposed to be next to an abandoned schoolhouse. It couldn't be that hard to find, right? 20 minutes later, after driving around, they spotted what appeared to be that. Just an old, dilapidated building that was once clearly a school. And right nearby was a small bridge that crossed over a canal. This had to be it. So they pulled onto the bridge and stopped right in the middle of it, just like the urban legend. Then, Bill killed the headlights, rolled down the windows so they could hear if anything weird started to happen. And of course, he turned the engine off. And for the next few minutes, they just sat in silence, and they struggled to hear anything unusual. But the only thing they could hear was the constant sound of water